Hi, everyone. Dr. Adriana Popescu here with you today. I am talking about brain spotting. This is one of my favorite modalities to work with. It's actually something newer that's shown up in my world, maybe in the last 3 or 4 years, kind of right before the pandemic, like in that year right before. I was introduced to brain spotting when I went to an energy psychology conference, and I attended a day-long workshop with Dr. David Grand, who is the creator of Brainspotting, and was so impressed with just that day-long workshop that I decided I wanted to do more training in it. And then I started using this technique with the clients I was seeing at the drug and alcohol rehab, where I'm the clinical director. And we specialize in treating trauma there. And brain spotting is a really excellent treatment for trauma. It also can be used for a lot of other things, and I'm going to talk about that, but primarily it's known as a trauma treatment. So I started using it with clients at the rehab as well as in my private practice, and was getting really good results with helping people heal from trauma. So I decided to, get more training. I became certified. I've now taken a number of workshops in brain spotting and its different applications. And we also have all our therapists at Avery Lane, the rehab where I work. They're all trained in brain spotting. We're using also at Firebird Healing, brain spotting is a primary modality that we're using because we've just found it to be so helpful. So let me tell you a little bit about it. So brain spotting evolved from another modality called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This was developed by Francine Shapiro. Gosh, I want to say maybe 40 years ago, at least in the 70s or 80s, I believe. And it was a technique that involved eye movements and left brain, right brain stimulation. And it was specifically designed to help people heal from trauma. There's a large body of research supporting its efficacy. It's very popular still today. There's a lot of programs and practitioners of EMDR. And David Grand was one of them. He's a psychologist in New York. And one day he found that he was working with a professional ice skater, or I believe she was a professional ice skater, who was having trouble landing a particular jump. So he had been using EMDR in the sense, not necessarily for trauma treatment, but for performance enhancement, which is another application of this tool, helping people overcome whatever blockages they may have to being successful at giving a performance. If let's say you were an actor or singer or something like that, or if you're an athlete, enhancing your performance. There's a whole field of psychology called sports psychology. And Dr. Grand was working in that area with an EMDR. So this ice skater was having trouble landing a triple toe or some kind of jump like that. And as he was using EMDR with her one day, he was moving his finger across her visual field. And he noticed that at one point, her whole body, like her eyes kind of wobbled, her body glitched. And he's like, well, that's interesting. She's having this neurological response to this one spot. So instead of continuing to move his finger, because, originally EMDR also had kind of you following, a finger across your visual field, he said, let's just hold your eyes, your gaze here on this one spot. And for the next, period of time, this whole torrent of abuse and trauma and all these things that she had experienced in her childhood with a difficult mother, all this stuff came out, and she cried and she emoted and all these things and felt better afterwards. And the next day when she went to practice doing the jump, she had no problem with it and never had a problem with it again. So, of course, being very intrigued with that, he started experimenting. He started deviating a little bit from the EMDR protocol and trying different things. And then he would have his colleagues who were also trained in EMDR experiment and try these different approaches. And that's really how brain spotting was born. And this was over 20 years ago. And where I think Dr. Grand really got a chance to perfect his technique is when 9/11 happened. So he was, a psychologist working in New York City, and all these people had been impacted by 9/11, and he was working with a lot of trauma survivors. And that's when he really got a lot of practice with this newer approach to trauma healing. And, that's how Brainspotting grew. And now it's in many countries all over the world. There's over 10 or 12,000 practitioners who've been trained in this. And, there are conferences and there are workshops and there are Facebook groups. And so there's this huge community of mental health practitioners. And also, the interesting thing is Dr. Grant did not limit training for Brainspotting just to licensed mental health professionals. There are coaches, there are other types of healers that use Brainspotting in their practices as well, and other kinds of healing practices. So that's really cool. And how does it work? Well, so essentially what we do, let's say if I'm working with, trauma, I'm having the person talk to me about, and it doesn't even have to be really big T trauma. It can be little T trauma. It could be, I had a conflict with my partner, or I'm really upset about something happening at work. Or I'm working with some core false beliefs, like I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, people leave me. But whatever the issue is, you get the person talking about it so that you can kind of activate the energy and bring it up. Okay. And then once you can tell they're kind of like getting worked up over it because they have an emotional charge, or they're starting to get, as they're remembering, some of the trauma experience that happened, they're getting that fight, flight, freeze response activated. And at that point, you ask them to check in with themselves and notice what's happening. So they might say, I have my heart is racing. I have a lump in my throat. My toes are tingling and I'm feeling really anxious. Okay. And then I will ask them to rate all those sensations and emotions on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is the most intense. And usually, we want to work with a fairly high activation of at least a 5 or more, but it's not always critical to do it that way. And then what we're doing essentially is, I can show you here, I have a pointer, okay? And then I start moving this pointer across the person's visual field, and we're looking for the specific location where they feel all that activation the most intensely, okay? And it might be somewhere like on an x-axis at their eye level. It might be up or down from there. It might be kind of towards them or away from them. And the cool thing is we can actually do Brainspotting over video, like we are doing, like over Zoom, which is really nice because it allows me to work with a lot of, people remotely with this technique. So once we kind of found the activation spot, which is often how we'll do this, there are many different setups with Brainspotting, but this is one of the most common ones. Once the person has that location, they just fix their gaze at the tip of the pointer. And as Dr. Grant says, at this point, we sit back and we just allow the brain to go wherever it needs to, meaning allowing the processing to occur, the focused processing. So there may be memories that come up. There may be emotions. I've worked a lot with physical trauma because I've been in car accidents and I've had various injuries. I might start feeling, different sensations in my body. And essentially what you're doing is you're just we're in the tail of the comet at that point. It's like the brain is the head of the comet, kind of leading the way. We're trusting that it knows where it needs to go. And we, the client and myself as the therapist are kind of in the tail of the comet being led. I really take a very non-directive, kind of just supportive role. I'm not analyzing, I'm not having conversation with the client. I might be checking in with them and just allowing the processing to occur. And that can take the whole session. It may take more than one session to work through a particular incident. Some people do longer sessions of Brainspotting. There are some practitioners who will do 90-minute sessions versus an hour to really allow for time, because it can take 45 minutes or more to really kind of work through a specific incident or memory. And especially if it's connected to other traumas, other memories might come up, other emotions. But eventually what we're trying to do is get that SUDS, the subjective units of distress, right? The 0 to 10 scale. We're trying to get that number down as close to 0 as we can get it. We may not get all the way to 0, but if you can help someone get from an 8, 9, 10 to a 2, 3, 4, that's going to be significantly better. And as we talk about at the rehab, the difference in that might keep a person sober, because what we find is when people get triggered, they have flashbacks, or they just get emotionally dysregulated, and that fight, flight, freeze mechanism gets activated because their amygdala is overactive, and it tends to overreact to situations that are not really life or death situations. I've talked about this in other videos before. So, when you have an overactive amygdala and you're constantly, getting emotionally triggered, you want to be able to, and that's when people are typically using drugs and alcohol or food or whatever addictive behavior they've developed, because it's a coping strategy to try to, calm themselves down. But if we can help people calm down with a technique like this, you wouldn't be brain spotting in the moment when you're having the upset. People can learn how to self-spot, but because it takes a while, oftentimes, we usually, do it in therapy sessions where you have at least an hour. And in conjunction with the visual spot, the person, it's optional, but it does help. The person can also be listening to this bilateral sound, which is doing the left brain, right brain stimulation that we had originally in EMDR. So it's interesting because the music kind of sounds like you have to listen to it through earphones. It sounds like it's sort of going in one ear and out the other, or like that the volume's getting turned up in one ear and then down in the other. And it's stimulating, again, these parts of the brain where we might have trauma stored. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests that, things like trauma, the things that we can't deal with, things that we repress, Peter Levine and Bessar van der Kolk, who are, big trauma experts, talk about this idea of a trauma capsule that we kind of just lock away somewhere in our bodies, somewhere in our brains. We lock away this information because it's too overwhelming to deal with at the time of the experience. And so that energy is still there and it's still influencing us, but we're not always fully aware of it. Something about the brain spotting and the psychedelics now, it looks like, are doing the same thing, the psychedelic assisted therapy, which is why they're using it a lot for trauma, especially the MDMA. It seems that the brain spotting or these medicines are able to open that capsule up and give us access to this previously repressed material. That way, in the safe environment with a therapist or someone who's trained in this, the person can actually experience those feelings that they couldn't deal with before and work their way through them. Okay, because the way emotions and stuff work is like they have a sort of natural life cycle of their own. I think of them as ocean waves, right? Like they start off calm, they build up, they get really intense, they kind of crescendo, and then they flow. It's like they ebb and flow, right? And if you let the emotions run their natural course, things will settle down. But in a trauma, what happens for people, it's like the pause button got hit and they couldn't deal with what was happening at the time. And then, all that material just gets stuck. A part of you gets stuck in the trauma. And so what we're trying to do with brain spotting and these other trauma healing methods is go back to that point in time and get the person unstuck. So to give you a real life example, when I was a kid, I was about 9 years old. I was in a really bad car accident with my mom and aunt. And it came from behind. I couldn't see it coming. And I remember having what I now know to be a fight, flight, freeze response. I had a freeze response. I went into shock. My system totally shut down. I remember feeling very cold. I was injured. My back was injured. I couldn't feel any pain. I remember being in an ambulance, but I couldn't speak because this is a survival mechanism, right? Like this is part of our, how we're all wired as animals. My body did that so that I wouldn't feel the pain, because maybe the intensity of the pain would have been overwhelming to me and I needed to survive that experience. So unbeknownst to me at the time, part of that experience and the fear and the panic and the pain and all of that was still in my body, but I didn't realize it. So many years later, fast forward, I'm in my late 20s and I get in another car accident, again, rear-ended, couldn't see it coming. And in the moment, at this point, I was in grad school, so I was used to kind of working with my emotions. In the moment, what happened was the fight, flight, freeze response got activated again. But this time I started shaking. And I remember thinking, don't repress it this time. Like, you're strong enough to handle this. You have skills and tools. And I started crying. I mean, I'm still in the car. It's just happened. I know I'm supposed to get out of the car and go talk to people and exchange information and get the cars off the road and like do things. But I was having a trauma response because my old trauma got activated, and all the memories and the emotions and the physical pain and everything came back in that flash. It's like that trauma capsule opened up again and all this material came flooding out. Luckily, at the time, I had tools. I knew how to do some breathing. I may have done some tapping, but I didn't stop the experience. So what happened was, with that particular, traumatic event, I didn't have lingering effects. There was a little bit around driving past that spot. There was a little bit of anxiety around just driving in general, but with the tools that I had at the time, and I didn't have Brainspotting then, I was able to work through it. So, so this is kind of the nature of trauma and what happens when we get overwhelmed and we don't get to like play the experience all the way through, play the tape all the way through, like I did with the second accident. And even with that, in doing brain spotting training, you practice with another person, another practitioner. And I worked on some of those there were 5 car accidents that I was in at various points. And my body still, was holding and may still be holding, some trauma, specifically whiplash injuries. There's a lot of tension in the muscles. I remember in one brain spotting session, I started feeling pain in that part of my back where I was injured the first time. So our bodies and our brains hold all of this energy and all of this information that most people aren't even aware of, but it still impacts you. Right? It's still there in the background affecting you. So I really love this particular technique because it is so efficient at accessing that stuff that you really can't access with your conscious mind, your prefrontal cortex. Dr. Grant talks a lot about how brain spotting is working with the subcortical regions of your brain, the more primitive parts of your brain, the mammalian and reptilian brain, because that's the part of your brain that's in charge of your survival mechanism. That's the part of the brain, the structures and functions of the brain that are involved in the fight, flight, freeze response. And then there's a whole vagus nerve component and polyvagal theory. And we just know so much more now about trauma and how it works. And we're learning more about how these techniques that we have discovered through clinical practice, research is now growing to support the efficacy of these techniques. And we're getting a better understanding of how it all works. So that's really, really cool. So I love brain spotting for trauma treatment. And the other thing that's really interesting with it is that as you bring the sort of the negative, emotional trauma kind of responses down, there's this sort of organic thing that starts to happen where people start connecting with their strengths, their more authentic or essential self, or their infinite being. There's something that happens. I remember working with a lady at the rehab early on when I was starting with brain spotting, who had been through one of the fires, these catastrophic fires we've had in California in the last few years. And it was really traumatic. I mean, she was literally driving out of town and trees above her were on fire, like really traumatic. And after doing maybe an hour and 15 minutes of this brain spotting, by the end, she'd calmed down so much. She'd re-experienced the whole thing, but she had calmed down, and this like inner wisdom came out. She had this moment of just like, I don't know, you could call it like spiritual awakening or clarity, where she's like, but I wouldn't go back and change it for anything, because it's brought me to this moment. It's brought me here, and I'm stronger now, and I know who I am and what do I want to do with my life. And she was able to get to that post-traumatic growth place, right? Where there's a strength. You can see that you're not just a victim of this thing. You're a survivor, and you can empower yourself to actually grow from the experience. And she really got to that place. And I think Dr. Grant saw that a lot with his folks as well. And so then he developed this expansion brain spotting, which is really about emphasizing the positive. So it might be something like having a spiritual awakening or having a moment of just like pure bliss or love, or, you know, if you're a performer having an amazing performance, we can use brain spotting to actually enhance that and grow that. So we could find a spot that correlates to, you know, you have the person talking about this like really positive experience they had, and then find a spot in their visual field that where they feel it even more so, and then they brain spot on that, and that helps them to continue to grow that good feeling or that confidence, you know, in performing or being at your best. So really very creative, very lots of interesting applications, a lot for creativity, stimulating creativity, for writers and musicians and whatever. Dr. Graham really does a lot with that stuff. So I'm a big fan of his work. I'm hoping to get him on the podcast someday, and you can find out more about him, about Brainspotting at the website, brainspotting.com. I just think it's a really, really powerful technique, and not a lot of people know about it. I didn't even know about it. I was surprised that this, you know, it had been around 17 years at the time that I discovered it. How did I not hear of this? And so part of why I'm going on live today is to just educate folks around this tool. And again, you know, you can do it yourself. I will brain spot myself. But, you know, do that with caution. You know, I suggest to I only really suggest that to my clients if they feel like, I feel like they have the coping skills to deal with whatever material comes up, because it is a bit like Pandora's box. We don't know what's going to come up, you know, when you start looking at that point. I prefer to do it in the safety and the containment of a therapy session. But yeah, if you want to find out more, feel free to reach out, ask me questions. I'm happy to share more information, and thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.